When people reach their 40s, 50s, or 60s and begin to notice real changes in their hair, the most common reaction is disbelief. It just started happening, they say. But hair loss at this stage of life is almost never sudden. What appears sudden is simply the moment when the body stops hiding the cost of years of adaptation. Aging doesn't create the problem, it exposes it. For decades, the body is remarkably forgiving. In earlier years, it compensates for poor sleep, nutritional shortcuts, chronic stress, inflammation, and hormonal strain. It finds ways to keep things looking stable on the surface. Hair continues to grow, even when conditions are far from ideal. But this compensation has a limit. After 40, that reserve begins to shrink. The margin for error narrows, and systems that depend on surplus, like hair growth, are the first to show it. Biologically, hair follicles are not a priority system. They function when there is excess energy, adequate nutrients, balanced hormones, and a relatively calm internal environment. When those conditions slowly erode over time, the body doesn't announce it immediately. It adapts quietly. Hair cycles shorten, growth slows, density decreases incrementally. Years later, why? The mirror finally reflects what has been happening beneath the surface all along. Psychologically, this moment is often misinterpreted as decline or failure. Many people see hair loss after 40 as proof that the body is breaking down. But this framing misses something essential. The body isn't collapsing. It's being honest. It's no longer able, why, or willing to compensate indefinitely. Hair loss becomes a form of feedback, a signal that the system has been operating under strain for too long. There's also a philosophical shift that happens here. Whether we recognize it or not, youth allows us to believe we are separate from biology. That discipline means pushing harder and ignoring signals. Midlife removes that illusion. It forces a confrontation with cause and effect. Not in a dramatic way, but in a precise one. Hair doesn't fall out to punish. It falls out to reveal where balance has been missing. Why? This understanding changes everything about solutions. If hair loss were truly random or purely age-driven, there would be little to do beyond acceptance. But because it is cumulative, it is also responsive. When metabolic stress is reduced, when nutrition becomes adequate rather than minimal, when inflammation is addressed, and when recovery is prioritized, the body often reallocates resources. Not magically, logically. The mistake many people make is assuming it's too late. In reality, the body is still adaptive at 40, 50, and 60. What changes is that it now requires clarity instead of chaos, consistency instead of extremes, support instead of pressure. Hair growth doesn't need force, it needs conditions. So the real insight is this: hair loss later in life is not the beginning of something going wrong. It is the end of the body covering things up. And once you understand that, hair loss stops being a sentence and becomes a message you can finally respond to. After 40, the conversation around hair loss often turns toward hormones, and for good reason. Why? But the mistake is to treat hormonal change as a verdict rather than a variable. Hormones do not suddenly turn against the body in midlife. They shift in response to time, stress, nutrition, sleep, inflammation, and metabolic health. Hair follicles are not victims of these shifts, they are sensors. As we age, the hormonal environment becomes less forgiving. Testosterone, estrogen, thyroid hormones, insulin, cortisol all continue to function, but with a narrower range of tolerance. Hair follicles, especially those genetically sensitive, respond more sharply to imbalance. This is why patterns of thinning become more noticeable after 40. It's not because hormones are stronger or weaker in isolation, but because the system as a whole has less room to absorb instability. What's often misunderstood is the role of DHT and other androgens. These hormones don't suddenly appear later in life. They've been present for decades. The difference is context. In a body with low inflammation, good circulation, stable blood sugar, and adequate nutrition, hair follicles tolerate hormonal signaling much better. When that internal environment deteriorates, why? The same signals produce a different outcome. Sensitivity increases, growth cycles shorten, hair spends more time resting and less time growing. There is a psychological trap here. Many people hear hormonal hair loss and immediately feel powerless, as if the solution lies entirely outside of their influence. But hormones are not external enemies. They are messengers. They respond to lifestyle inputs continuously. Sleep deprivation, chronic stress, restrictive eating, insulin spikes, and inflammation all alter hormonal behavior. Why? The follicle is simply reporting the state of that conversation. Philosophically, this reframes aging itself. Aging is not a collapse of systems, it is a demand for coherence. In earlier years, the body can tolerate contradictions. High stress with low recovery, poor diet with high output. Later, it cannot. Hormonal shifts are not punishments, they are signals that the system requires alignment. Hair loss appears when that alignment has been missing for too long. This is why fighting hormones rarely works. Suppression without support creates new imbalances. What works is stabilization, supporting insulin sensitivity, reducing inflammation, maintaining muscle mass, prioritizing sleep, and managing stress all create a hormonal environment in which hair follicles feel less threatened. Why? Growth becomes possible not because hormones are eliminated, but because they are contextualized. The deeper truth is that hair follicles don't need perfection. They need predictability. They need a body that sends consistent signals of safety and sufficiency. When those signals stabilize, the follicle often responds even later in life. So the question is not whether hormones change after 40. They do. The real question is whether the body is supported enough to handle those changes without sacrificing growth. Why? Because hormones don't decide your fate. They reflect your internal environment. And when that environment becomes coherent, hair loss stops being inevitable and starts becoming informative. As the conversation moves deeper, a connection that is often overlooked becomes impossible to ignore: the link between muscle, metabolism, and hair. After 40, this relationship becomes critical. Hair loss is rarely just about the scalp. It reflects what is happening systemically, and muscle mass plays a far larger role than most people realize. Beginning in midlife, why the body naturally loses muscle unless it is actively maintained. This process is subtle. You don't wake up one day suddenly weak. But year by year, muscle tissue declines, and with it goes metabolic efficiency. Muscle is not just about strength or appearance, it is a metabolic organ. It regulates blood sugar, supports hormonal balance, improves circulation, and helps distribute nutrients. When muscle mass decreases, all of these systems become less efficient. Hair follicles feel that change immediately. From a biological standpoint, why hair growth is energy intensive. It requires oxygen, amino acids, minerals, and a steady metabolic signal that says resources are available. Muscle tissue helps create that signal. It improves insulin sensitivity, meaning nutrients are more likely to reach cells instead of remaining trapped in the bloodstream. It supports circulation, ensuring that what the body has actually arrives at the follicle. Without sufficient muscle, the body becomes conservative. Growth is no longer assumed, it is rationed. Psychologically, there is often resistance to this idea. Many people associate muscle building with youth, athleticism, or vanity. After 40, they shift focus toward preservation rather than growth. Why? But the body doesn't understand intentions, it understands input. When physical challenge disappears, the body adapts downward. Less muscle leads to lower metabolic demand, which leads to reduced nutrient flow, which ultimately affects tissues that depend on surplus, including hair. There is also a philosophical layer here that mirrors many other aspects of aging. Growth requires effort. Maintenance requires engagement. When we stop challenging the system, it doesn't remain neutral, it declines. Hair loss, in this context, becomes a reflection of withdrawal. Not failure, but disengagement. What's important to understand is that this isn't about extreme training or chasing youth. It's about sending a biological signal of relevance. Resistance training, adequate protein intake, and consistent movement tell the body that strength is still required. When strength is required, metabolism remains active. When metabolism remains active, nutrient delivery improves. And when nutrient delivery improves, hair follicles feel supported rather than expendable. This also explains why purely cosmetic hair solutions often fall short later in life. You cannot stimulate growth at the edge if the center is underpowered. The scalp does not exist in isolation. It reflects the body's overall willingness to invest in regeneration. The encouraging part is that muscle responds at any age. Even in the 50s and 60s, the body adapts quickly to strength signals. Metabolic improvements can happen in weeks. Hair response, being slower, follows later. but it does follow when conditions are restored. So the deeper message is simple: hair grows in bodies that are still asked to be strong. And when you remind your body that strength matters, it often remembers that growth does too. As muscle and metabolism decline with age, another force quietly steps forward and accelerates hair thinning inflammation. Why? Not the dramatic kind that sends you to bed with a fever, but the low-grade chronic inflammation that becomes almost invisible because it feels normal. After 40, this type of inflammation stops being background noise and starts becoming a deciding factor. In earlier years, the body can absorb inflammatory insults without obvious consequences. Poor sleep, sugar spikes, ultra-processed foods, chronic stress, alcohol, gut irritation, all of this creates inflammation, but the system compensates. Later in life, that buffering capacity weakens. The same inputs now produce a stronger response. Hair follicles, which rely on a stable internal environment, are especially sensitive to this shift. Biologically, inflammation interferes with the hair growth cycle. It shortens the growth phase and pushes follicles prematurely into rest. Blood flow becomes less efficient. Nutrient delivery is disrupted. The follicle doesn't die, it simply pauses. Over time, repeated inflammatory signals teach the follicle that growth is risky. Thinning becomes the safest option. What makes this difficult to recognize is that chronic inflammation rarely announces itself. You may feel functional, busy, even productive, but the body is constantly managing micro-stress. Blood sugar rises and falls sharply. Cortisol stays elevated. The immune system remains slightly activated. This internal tension becomes the new baseline. Hair growth, which requires calm and consistency, quietly steps aside. Psychologically, many people normalize this state. Stress becomes identity. Fatigue becomes routine. Inflammation becomes invisible because it's everywhere. But the body keeps score. Hair doesn't respond to motivation or discipline. It responds to environment. When the environment is inflammatory, growth is postponed. There is also a philosophical message hidden here. Inflammation represents friction. It is what happens when inputs and capacity are mismatched. When we demand more than we recover from, the system heats up. In youth, we mistake tolerance for resilience. In midlife, the difference becomes clear. Hair loss is one of the earliest indicators that friction has exceeded adaptability. This is why adding more interventions often backfires. More supplements, more stimulants, more aggressive routines can increase inflammation rather than reduce it. The body doesn't need to be pushed, it needs to be cooled. Reducing inflammatory foods, stabilizing blood sugar, improving sleep, calming the nervous system, and supporting gut health all send a different signal. They say you don't need to stay on guard. When inflammation decreases, something subtle but powerful happens. The body reallocates resources. Circulation improves. Hormonal signaling becomes clearer. The hair follicle senses a safer environment and gradually re-enters growth. Not immediately and not dramatically, but logically. This is why inflammation is such a silent accelerator of hair thinning after 40. It doesn't cause sudden loss. It erodes the conditions for growth until thinning feels inevitable. But inevitability is often just prolonged neglect disguised as aging. The deeper insight is this: hair does not require constant stimulation. It requires peace. And when the body finally exits a state of internal friction, growth becomes a natural consequence rather than a forced goal. As we move further into midlife, another subtle shift becomes decisive: the difference between eating well and actually absorbing well. After 40, 50, and beyond. Why? Many people are surprised to learn that the problem is no longer what they consume, but what their body can process and deliver. Hair loss often persists not because nutrients are absent, but because they never fully arrive where they're needed. With age, digestion changes. Stomach acid tends to decrease. Enzyme production slows. Gut lining integrity can weaken after years of stress, inflammation, medications, irregular eating, or ultra-processed food. None of this usually causes immediate pain, so it goes unnoticed. But absorption efficiency declines quietly. Minerals, amino acids, and vitamins pass through the system without being fully utilized. Hair follicles, which sit at the far edge of nutrient distribution, feel this deficit first. Biologically, why? This explains a common frustration. I eat healthy, I take supplements, but my hair keeps thinning. The assumption is that intake equals nourishment, but the body doesn't operate on intention. It operates on delivery. Hair follicles don't respond to labels like clean or Balanced. They respond to what actually reaches the bloodstream, then the tissue, then the cell. When absorption is compromised, even the best diet becomes insufficient. There's also a psychological layer that's easy to miss. Many people approach nutrition as accumulation, adding more foods, more supplements, more strategies. But after a certain point in life, growth depends less on addition and more on integration. If the system is overwhelmed, more input creates more noise. The body needs clarity, not excess. Philosophically, this reflects a broader truth about aging. In youth, we can afford inefficiency, the system compensates. Later, coherence becomes essential. What we take in must be digestible, not just impressive. Hair loss becomes a signal that something is being lost in translation between effort and outcome. Stress plays a central role here. Chronic tension shifts the nervous system into defense mode, diverting blood flow away from digestion. Enzymes decrease. Absorption suffers. Even when eating enough, the body is not in a state to receive. Hair follicles, sensitive to this internal climate, interpret it as scarcity. This is why restoring digestion and absorption often changes the trajectory of hair loss more than changing the diet itself. Regular meals, slower eating, simpler foods, reduced inflammatory triggers, and a calmer nervous system all improve assimilation. When the gut feels safe, nutrients are absorbed more efficiently. When nutrients arrive consistently, hair follicles regain confidence. What's important is patience. Improved absorption doesn't show up in the mirror immediately. Hair grows slowly, and it reflects changes retroactively. But when the internal environment becomes more receptive, growth gradually returns, not because it's forced, but because it's no longer blocked. So the deeper lesson here is not about eating more, but about receiving more. Because after midlife, the body doesn't reward effort alone, it rewards coherence. And when nourishment is finally received instead of merely consumed, hair stops being sacrificed to inefficiency. When everything we've discussed comes together, nutrition, hormones, metabolism, inflammation, absorption, the final understanding is this: hair loss after 40, 50, or 60 is not a verdict. It is feedback, and feedback by definition exists to be listened to, not feared. One of the most damaging beliefs people carry is that hair loss later in life means the body is giving up. But the body doesn't give up, it adapts. Hair thinning is not a sign of collapse, it's a sign of prioritization. When resources become limited or conditions feel unsafe, the body reallocates energy toward what keeps you alive, not what keeps you aesthetically satisfied. Hair is never abandoned randomly. It is paused deliberately. Psychologically, this is where people often turn against their own biology. Hair loss becomes personal. It feels like betrayal. And so the response is control, more treatments, more urgency, more pressure. But pressure is rarely what restores balance. The body doesn't respond to force, it responds to context. Why? Hair loss is not asking to be fought. It's asking to be understood. There is something profoundly intelligent about the timing of hair loss in midlife. It often appears at the same stage when people are forced to confront limits, energy limits, recovery limits, emotional limits. The body is saying, the way you've been living has worked until now. From here on, it won't. Hair loss becomes one of the earliest and clearest signals of that transition. Philosophically, this reframes aging itself. Aging is not deterioration, it is refinement. It strips away excess tolerance. It demands alignment. In youth, the body absorbs inconsistency. In midlife, it requires coherence. Hair loss is part of that demand. It reveals where effort and recovery, input and absorption, stress and nourishment are no longer balanced. This is why addressing hair loss later in life is never just cosmetic. It's systemic. When people restore rhythm, regular meals, sufficient protein, strength, sleep, stress regulation, digestive support, the body often responds positively even years later. Not always by restoring everything that was lost, but by stabilizing what remains and, in many cases, improving density and quality. Growth becomes possible again when survival mode ends. What matters most is how the signal is interpreted. If hair loss is treated as an enemy, the response is panic. If it's treated as information, the response becomes intelligent adjustment. The body is not asking for perfection, it's asking for cooperation. There is also something deeply empowering in this perspective. It removes blame. It replaces fear with responsibility. Hair loss stops being a mystery and becomes a conversation, one in which the body has been speaking for a long time. So the final takeaway is simple but not easy. Hair loss is not the body failing you. It's the body finally being honest with you. And when you stop silencing the signal and start responding to it, growth, whether of hair, health, or self-awareness, becomes possible again.